Hello and welcome everyone to this online event hosted by the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies. And we're talking about big tech and free speech today. I'm Roland Freudenstein, Martens Centre Policy Director, and these are my three kickoff speakers. We have Hélène Chivot, who is Senior Advisor on Digital Policy at the EPP, the European People's Party. We've got Felix Karte, who is a Senior Advisor at Reset, consultant about digital threats and former anti-disinfo warrior at the European External Action Services Stratcom team. And last but not least, Giga Turk, who is professor at the University of Ljubljana, is a member of the Academic Council of the Martens Centre, and former Minister of Education and Science in the government of the Republic of Slovenia. Now, the topic of how to keep democracy safe in the age of social media has been with us for a long time, especially in the liberal democracies of Europe and the US. And when I say keep democracy safe, well, that already contains the dilemma that we're talking about today. Averting dangers arising from radicalization, disinformation, and incitement to violence, while maintaining the freedom of opinion and speech. And therefore, the EU is wrestling with the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act, and therefore the decision of several social media platforms, beginning with Twitter and Facebook, to ban the then still President Donald Trump on January 8th, 2 days after the storming of the Capitol, was so hotly debated. So we take this as our point of departure to ask how governments, EU institutions, big tech companies, but also civil society should act in order to keep democracy safe. And we start with an initial round of personalized questions and follow-ups, and then we'll open up to questions and answers. So let's kick off with Felix Karte. Felix, the decision to ban Trump from Twitter and Facebook. Why was it taken and what were the effects?
So I think that's a great question that probably only Facebook and Twitter could answer accurately. But my strong suspicion is that this decision was taken for political and economic motives, because those are private companies, and they knew that they would soon be dealing with a new president in the US who has a very different stance on tech regulation and the responsibility of those platforms for democracy than his predecessor Trump. And I think that also highlights really the main problem we're dealing with, which is more that arbitrariness and lack of transparency in how these decisions are taken rather than the substance of the decision itself. Because what I really want to stress is that we have to be very careful not to confuse content moderation with censorship, because those are two very different things. And in fact, I think we as the EU, as concerned public, should encourage the platforms to take down inciting language, harassment, bullying, all of these things, because otherwise we won't have civic spaces online where people can engage. And what I also want to add is that I think, or what I'm afraid of, is that by having this discussion now, we are distracting ourselves a little bit from the actual issue, which are the technical design features of the platforms that lead to the large-scale amplification and propagation of violent and inciting content and disinformation in the first place. And that's exactly what we saw ahead of the US insurrection, the violent storm of the Capitol. We saw, for instance, that Facebook's recommender systems promoted groups in which violence was promoted and orchestrated and incited. And this is, I think, where regulation has to look at. It's not about individual speech-related decisions, but it's really about making platforms accountable for their business and design choices.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. But coming back to this question of, did censorship start on January 8th, or wasn't there an inbuilt bias to start with? on more or less all social media platforms due to the algorithms. Could you please elaborate a little bit on this? And to what extent has there always been criticism of social media platforms because of these algorithms, which themselves constitute a kind of a steering of any kind of public debate? And a big difference, by the way, to classical media like, for example, print newspapers, where you choose what you want to read and not the algorithm.
Yeah. So I think this notion of bias, and especially anti-conservative bias, is a narrative that we're not seeing only in the US, but also in Germany. It's exactly what the AfD are claiming here in Germany. It's what the Polish government is claiming now, what the Hungarian government are claiming. And as I just tried to highlight, I think that's a very dangerous path. And I think we should be super careful not to adopt and promote this idea, because it is simply not true. And basically, all that those players want is to be able to harass and disinform and bully and get away with it. That's what they want. If platforms formulate their own content policies that may be narrower than what would be permissible under freedom of speech, that's their perfectly legitimate right. They're most welcome to do that. Every newspaper has editorial policies. If somebody comes to my house and uses racist or homophobic language, I would kick them out as well. That's perfectly legitimate and should not be the concern of the government. The only concern of the government should be to ensure that illegal content, clearly identify illegal content, is taken down by the platforms, and the platforms should only respond to those requests in as far as those laws are in line with international human rights law.
Okay, Giga, let's move on to you, and coming back to this hotly debated decision on January 8th. So was that just symptomatic of a larger progressive drive for censorship in social media? And I may quote your tweet at this point of a couple of weeks ago. Twitter can silence anyone at any time. Freedom of expression is effectively controlled by CEOs of a few corporations. And this is not what the authors of human rights charters had in mind. End of quote. So, Giga, how do you see this whole debate?
Well, the tweet actually summarizes quite well what I think about this. I mean, you could call it a conspiracy theory that there is a kind of an inherent bias in the social media against the right and the center right. But if you just call it a conspiracy theory, that does not invalidate it. In fact, the very term conspiracy theory that's one conspiracy theory. It was invented by the CIA to discredit some of the doubts into the Warren Commission with respect to the Kennedy assassination. So let's see, how much of a conspiracy and how much of a theory is there. There was recently published a scientific paper in the Nature magazine, and I will just switch my beautiful face for this picture for a while, which shows kind of the graph, of the followers and of the people in the social media. The blue ones are the left Democrats, the red ones are the Republicans, and the orange yellow are the QAnons. And the black dots are those who have been canceled or that have been purged. There is a dot at the largest black dot at the lower part of the red of the red blob, which is Donald Trump. And the purge was somehow, the ratio was like 10-1 between the blue and the red and orange. And there's another interesting element that can be seen in this picture, and that is that when the accounts in the red and in the yellow area were canceled, they were the kind of influencer accounts. They were the kind of key people who, it was not like rank and file followers. While if you look at the black dots in the blue part, it's a large part of that are kind of let's say, followers and not leaders. So you could say there is some statistics that support that. Now you could always claim that the right, the center right, the QAnon use worse language than the Antifa and the others on the left. There's another graphics that I can share, and that is what does the Silicon Valley think, how they align politically. If you look at the money that they put into the support of political parties, you see a huge advantage of the blue color versus the red color. I think the largest donor to the Republican camp in the last elections was Amazon. That gave Republicans something like 15% of the funds. So I think there is a lot of substantiation that there is a bias, where in fact it should not be, because Twitter, Facebook, under the current legislation, this could change, but under the current legislation, they are not seen as editors. They cannot be prosecuted, they cannot be charged for doing editorial decisions because they are exempt from that through the legislation that's very similar in the US and in Europe. And I'm very much convinced that they actually represent what is a public square. The human rights legislation that was protecting freedom of expression, I believe the intent of that was to make sure that there exists a possibility to express ideas in the open. And yes, there are limits in those declarations to what governments can do, because in the era of printed press and maybe a few television channels, so in the 1950s of the last century, indeed it was the government, the only one with the power to suppress freedom of expression. And today we have totally unaccountable private companies that can do that. And the danger is that they will be doing that so that they would try to please some politicians and some politics and not please the others. And what this would result in is that people would flee those public spaces where people still talk among each other. It's still a debate between the various political groups. And we would actually get enclaves where only the liberals and the progressives will talk to each other, and only the conservatives and the others will talk to each other. And I think that would really be bad when we stop talking among each other.
Okay, that's very clear. And I think this is a lot of food for thought here. Felix, if you would like to comment at this point, you can have a brief interjection. Otherwise, I move on to Elina. Felix, you want to respond to some of those points about the bias, for example?
All I want to make clear is that we have to distinguish between content policies and their enforcement and recommender systems, so algorithms basically that indeed may have bias and that require more scrutiny. But those are two different things, and I don't think that government should interfere with content policies unless they are too permissive as regards illegal content.
Okay, then let's briefly move on. And Elina, does the EU have a better approach to balancing free speech and regulation than the United States? Maybe you can also give the EPP's position on this. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Roland, and thank you to the Martens Centre for the invitation. First of all, it's great to discuss this topic because translating the functioning principle of democracies, which means searching for compromise and common ground in the digital sphere, into the digital sphere, that's a fundamental question. Now, does the EU have a better approach than the US? And even to go further than your question, can the EU approach, which is the DSA, the Digital Services Act, which has been tabled by the Commission, can it provide a solution to the broader issue of online free speech? Well, Well, first off, in the US, the system is comparable to some extent only. They have the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which gives social media companies immunity from liability for the content that their users are posting. And as some of you know, it's become a driving focus of the Trump administration, and Biden said that he'd be in favor of overhauling and revoking, Section 230. And one thing to mention in the U.S. context is that there's a popular belief that Section 230 is what's been stopping the government from pulling the plug on Twitter for exposing lying elected officials and such. But there's the First Amendment on top of that, that is freedom of speech protections. And websites are their private entities, and they have protections for the content that they choose or choose not to carry. And there's no right of access or right to speak on property that is privately owned. And online, that's called content moderation. You could say that the First Amendment protects Twitter from Trump, but not Trump from Twitter. And so perhaps whether big tech's decision to censor Trump was right or wrong isn't quite the way we should think about it from our European lens. Trump's First Amendment rights haven't been violated because you don't have a right to say whatever you want on Facebook and Twitter, basically. My next point would be to mention that by virtue of the internet's birth in the US, the conceptions of acceptable speech rooted in the First Amendment, which is an American feature, has become the founding value of the global web, if you will. And US platforms have exported these values as well. So there's a tension now between them and these values and their international scope, which plays out in their decisions to suspend political leaders. But in Europe, we have different values and different conceptions of what free speech is and what is okay or not to say. Now, moving to us, is our approach promising? The way the DSA is built, actually, Twitter would be in its right to do what it did to Trump. Now, the premise of the DSA, many would say, is that what is illegal online, what is illegal offline should be illegal online. And that's, of course, easier said than done, and perhaps we can get back to that later. There's clearly a need to update our rules given the challenges of the digital economy and age, and that means legal clarity for internet companies and their obligations. That means procedures and safeguards and transparency rules for removing illegal content, and to ensure that free speech is restricted only in accordance with the law. One idea is to increase transparency on how the decisions are made. So if platforms want to ban a user, they would have to notify the user and explain why that is. And of course, the objectives are laudable, like this protecting freedom of expressions and consumer protection. It's also good that some basic principles were maintained, because that's what's been, making possible the things we enjoy using various platforms today. And you have the reinforcement of those protections and a pan-European system with notice and action rules, which didn't exist before, or was missing. So there is some consensus that everyone agrees we want harmonization, we want clear rules, no additional bureaucracy, something that can be applicable in member states. And we'll have to see what the Parliament does with the Commission's proposal. And as far as member states, some would prefer tackling harmful content in the DSA, others would want to have it limited to illegal content. Disinformation as such will not be really regulated by the DSA. That's something to note. But the transparency rules that will stem from the proposal can create the preconditions for further policies. And maybe to conclude on that, it's a step in the right direction. Perhaps we need to be more ambitious. But it's a really, really difficult issue, even internally within the EU, and we can get back to that later. There's going to be challenges related to implementation, enforcement, the root causes to be tackled, migration of content to below the iceberg platforms, and what is unpleasant and offensive may be legal in one country, but illegal in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, let me come to this particular point that you raised at the end. The difference between the member states in the European Union at the moment, because as we speak, the Polish and Hungarian government are introducing national legislations to, in a way, as they would put it, defend free speech and keep the platforms from what they would call censoring consumers and censoring people. I mean, how do these initiatives play with the European Union as a whole and the attempts to have the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act?
Yeah, there's clearly an issue. You can see member states jumping the gun on with their own initiatives, and that could be challenging the DSA by exceeding its term, by proposing things that haven't been foreseen in the DSA. We've seen, you mentioned Poland and Hungary. We've seen that as well in Germany and in France. One thing I can bring up is, it's a sensitive issue for Poland's nationalist government. Some of those members have come under fire for attacking LGBT rights. The issue of censorship and media freedom cuts across political line, but there's a worry that some governments may not be well placed to deal with a sensitive issue. So that's and of course there's the issue of cross-border alignment. If a member state can force its views on another member states, it can be something closer to coercion than cooperation. Now, again, to round up on that, the DSA's idea is to provide uniform rules to tackle the regulatory fragmentation that we have across the internal market. And that is quite critical if you want a well-functioning online environment and ecosystem for platforms in Europe. And regulatory complexity tends to annoy incumbents, but mainly, crush or be a hindrance for startups and SMEs. So yeah, the lack of symmetry and harmonization across member states, I think, is something the Commission and policymakers are really taking a close look at.
Okay, thank you very much. We already have a couple of questions, but I would like to continue maybe for a little bit with this question of a unified European approach. Felix, I mean, there is a German legislation with the absolutely mind-blowingly beautiful name of Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz. All the consonants in this. Can you summarize where this has come under fire from other EU member states, from free speech advocates, and maybe even from the European institutions, because I think it goes much further than the DSA and the DMA in restricting platforms. But please tell us.
So, I hope no real NetzDG experts are listening in, because otherwise I might have to deliver a few apologies later. But what the main...
They will ban you. If you make one wrong word, and they will ban you now.
I will be banned for life. Yeah, deplatformed from the universe. But I really think that the approach in terms of prescribing basically procedural or due diligence provisions in terms of, for instance, defining time spans within which platforms have to take down specified types of illegal content upon notification, it's not so different from the DSA. I think the main problem raised by free speech experts, but I have the suspicion that Eileen is actually more of an expert on that than me, is that we cannot ask the platforms to execute this public mandate without then also scrutinizing how they execute it. And what I'm referring to specifically is the problem of overblocking, for instance, that there are insufficient safeguards to ensure that platforms won't just take down whatever just to make sure that they're not getting fined afterwards by the regulator or by the government. That is a major problem. Otherwise, I actually don't see too much of a conflict with the DSA in terms of the mechanics that these two legislative acts contain. What I do think is problematic is that the NetzDG, in fact, looks like an attempt to me to regulate a business in Germany or an information service provider who is actually located in Ireland. And that seems to be a breach of the country of origin principle at first hand. But I think a lot of lawyers would have to say more insightful things about that.
Okay, thank you. First question from a participant, and I will direct it to Giga, and then whoever else would like to come in can come in. So Patrick Penix is asking, who should decide what hate speech actually is, the platforms or the judiciary? I think this is ideal for you, Giga.
Well, listening to this debate, and listening to actually a difficult problem, how to regulate this new communication and also social ecosystem. I think the guiding principle should be that you should be restricting the platforms, or the government should be restricting the platforms on how much these platforms are restricting the users. And there is a perfectly valid restriction to say that anything that is illegal should not be posted. And in my view, it should be the governments that should be policing that, to put it very bluntly, perhaps with the aid of the platforms, etc. But if it is illegal, it is not some private vigilantes that should be taking care of that. The problem is everything else, and I think this excuse that this is a private platform and that the private platform can do how it sees things. I think there are limits to that as well, because if I remember correctly, that bus company that was putting African Americans to the back of the buses was a private company. And entirely correctly, the government stepped in and said, no, look, we understand you're a private company, but you should not be making these distinctions. And in the same way, I think the platforms should be limited in making distinctions according to certain lines. That is something to be supervised. That is something where they need to be limited. I think it would be extremely short-sighted to put even more power into the hands of the platforms. It is the public, it is the democratic system that should have, and it is the rule of law that should have a final say.
Okay, thank you. Felix, would you like to come in here?
Could you specify the question you would like me to address a little more?
Well, the example of Rosa Parks and the racial segregation in the South, and the whole parallel to what could be happening on social platforms today. Is because you used initially, your initial kickoff, you used this the meme of we are dealing with private companies and they have a right to decide what is happening on their platforms. So Giga just presented a counter view to that, or at least maybe you could live with the idea that yes, they are private platforms, but there are certain overall rules which must be respected.
Yes, that is absolutely true. So, but this is what I try to highlight in the beginning is, of course, they have to abide by the law, and as far as the law is in line with international human rights. If now I think the Russian government declares LGBTI content illegal, I don't think we should expect the platforms to comply with it and take down all of it when we have seen or have read horrendous news from India and Russia these past days as well, where India tried to use their leverage, or the Indian government, to crack down on dissident speech on Twitter as well. So I totally think, of course, that platforms have to comply with the law when it comes to content policies, but they can also have rules that are content policies that are narrower than those. Because otherwise, I mean, I think I mentioned the other day the case of the high-profile German Green politician Renate Künast, who has been suing and going to court several times because she found that certain kinds of extremely vulgar insults against her on Facebook were illegal, but ultimately courts, and those should be the ones making that call in the end, each time said that the majority of the posts that she was complaining about were in fact permissible expressions of opinion. And still, I think that platforms should be allowed to take that stuff down because it's inhumane and evil and crowds vulnerable groups and basically anybody with a soul out of public discourse, because you can't participate when this kind of speech is allowed on the platforms. So yeah, that's the distinction we have to draw, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Giga, I saw you slightly shaking your head. Would you like to respond to this?
Roland, you know me, I would be the last person to use any kind of insulting language and focusing myself towards somebody that person would feel bad about what I say, and so on and so forth. But I think it should not be some algorithms at Facebook or Twitter that do that, or even some activists in Facebook or Twitter that are protecting me from being insulted. It is the judicial system. It is the rule of law. If I have been insulted enough, I will go to court and I will get a few thousand or 10,000 euros in compensation. And that would be reported, that would be in the press, and the people will start behaving. Yes, I know personally it's a cruel world out there, but I prefer that cruelty to a mirage of safety which is provided to me by some nanny operators in the offices of Twitter and Facebook. And this probably is the most difficult question, how can we raise the quality of the debate? It has to be a free debate. It has to be a competition of ideas, because this is why in the West we capitalized on our individualism and on our kind of a plurality of things. How to make that civil. And there are better ways to do that. For example, promoting real, true identities. You would get the worst language, the most insulting stuff would be said about you from some anonymous accounts that make this account, sometimes just to insult you. So why not encourage that? That, for example, I can sue Twitter if an anonymous person that I cannot trace says something bad or wrong or slandering about me. And then Twitter would be interested in knowing who the users are and actually promoting true identities. And this is how things work in real life,
Yes, Eileen, you come in first, and then Felix will also respond to this. And then we need to come back to questions because I already got a couple of others. Eileen, please.
Great. I just wanted to make a couple of points based on what I've heard. So some are actually advocating for, instead of providing additional content standards, that you'd require online services to provide, to provide more transparency about their policies and processes for responding to illegal content, and the appeals that the processes for appeals that are available for users. That they should release regular reports on their actions, like the number of takedown requests received, the results of those requests, the number of appeals, the time it took them to respond. So that can be helpful, in that respect. And I think I've just to a point I've also heard, I think some are actually saying that, well, while you would maintain anonymity, everyone should be digitally identifiable where it's necessary, with a protected European digital identity. I know that's an idea that has been tabled. And another point I wanted to mention was how, harmful or illegal content and the people posting that, they find niche platforms to which they migrate. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't take action and that it's hopeless to try. But if you stigmatize those people or regulate super harshly the big ones, only that well, or mainly, that they will only tackle the top of the iceberg. So tackling the root causes is just as important. In the UK, they said recently that they want to change the law to make social media companies more accountable for what happens on their platforms in reaction to racial abuse on social media against football professionals, football players. And you could give greater powers to police potentially illegal content, but the question is how the legislation would stop racist posts from making their way onto social media. Would it potentially hold companies to account, possibly? So the key point is that there's really more to be done to tackle the causes like racism and such that mostly stems from people's offline behavior. And I think users are also to be held accountable to some extent for the content that they post. And we should also at the same time, in terms of elevating maybe the debate, as I heard Ziga mention, that we should start talking about the incentives built into these platforms that drive users down misinformation rabbit holes and create anger and polarization. Just wanted to share those 2 points. I hope that's helpful. Oh, we lost Roland. We lost our moderator.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Felix, would you want to come in on this?
Yeah,
then we get back to the questions.
What I just want to say is that I think, or like to push back slightly at Giga, is that I think we shouldn't have too much of a one-dimensional conception of freedom and freedom of speech. I don't think that an unmoderated online debate is a free one. It's only the freedom of the bullies. I think that if we let hate and harassment reign freely on the platform, so if the platforms do that, so many voices will be silenced and basically lose their own ability to participate freely in public discourse. That's one thing. And what I would also like to ask Giga maybe is that look at TikTok, for instance. It's a group, it's a platform used primarily, not only, but a lot by minors of age. Do you think that TikTok should not be allowed to take down insulting content, bad words, and basically punish people who do cyber mobbing and bullying, even though a court may not have ruled it illegal?
Go ahead.
First of all, about dimensionality, definitely the problem is not unidimensional, but I don't see that freedom should be balanced by censorship. I believe freedom should be balanced by responsibility. You should build responsibility into that system, and I don't want to be understood as if I'm advocating for mandatory identity of everything or identification of everything that is being said on social media. What I'm saying is there should be an encouragement of using of the real identity. So you could have an algorithm that kind of pushes into your feed more of the stuff that has real identity and less of the stuff which is anonymous, but it need not be an absolute one. And to the issue of TikTok and the general kind of freedom of private businesses to kind of shape what goes on their platforms. I think we need to make a distinction, again, borrowing, from the history of human rights discussions and lawsuits and decisions. We should make decision, let's say, between bus companies and bakers. There was a famous case also about this bakery that would not bake a cake for a particular couple. And the difference is that you do not have a choice or a realistic choice for taking a bus or for transportation, but you have a huge choice of bakeries. So in the case of TikTok, I would say, no, they are catering to a niche audience, and they could shape their stream according to that audience. I would not claim that they are the public square, like maybe a handful, maybe 5 platforms that do have this attribute. And if you're kicked out of those 5, you're kind of, you don't have a public voice anymore. I mean, you can go to the street with a bell and, ring, the end is nigh, but it's not the same as doing the same thing on Facebook. So this is how I would respond.
Okay, thank you. This is a fascinating debate, but let's go back to some of the questions. And we have Jana Brovdi from the College of Europe. What are your thoughts on Facebook's Oversight Board? Well, I think this touches upon some of the questions that we've already dealt with, but maybe who volunteers to answer that question? Felix.
So I think it's perfectly normal and legitimate that big corporations would consult expertise, and Facebook is actually getting a lot of it for free, probably too much of it for free, where other huge corporations would have to pay for it. I just think that we may not allow Facebook into gaslighting us, or to gaslight us into believing that this is a substitute for proper regulation. I actually think, again, and there I might actually be like on the same page with Giga. I think that this is again an attempt at deflecting true accountability, because accountability should be for indeed their design choices and their technical infrastructure, their algorithms, and how they relate to the fundamental rights of users. It should not be about some like 3 or 4 high profile content moderation choices. But it's a nice initiative for sure, especially from PR perspective.
Of course, very important. We have Dimitar Lilkov from the Martens Centre, who asks, is algorithmic transparency and independent oversight actually possible? Again, and he directs this to you, Felix, so that's you again.
I am not enough of a technical expert to answer that question, but I know that it should be possible. And if it's not currently, then regulators should build the skill sets and capacity needed to execute that kind of transparency. I do think that they should take, or independent regulators, and the exclamation mark is really with independent, should take a close look at how algorithms or algorithmic content distribution impacts, for instance, fundamental right to non-discrimination, but also to free speech, all of these issues. And I think that's actually not as technically challenging as it may sound.
So you would have to translate the machine code into some more understandable summary for the general public, right?
I don't even think we necessarily need to look at the code so much as its impact. I mean, we can, for instance, put together a representative sample of citizens and use techniques like Who Targets Me or the Citizen browser, who then crowdsource and collect all the content and ads that have been displayed to this representative sample of citizens. And then we can discuss if we think that the way that digital media were distributed to these people complies with ideas such as media pluralism and information and speech rights.
Okay, Eileen and then Giga on this question too.
Yeah, just to comment on that question, and thank you to the participants for the interesting questions, by the way. In the DSA, actually, there's this challenge to ensure that algorithms are audited independently. That would be done by trusted flaggers. So there's this idea of making government agencies responsible as trusted flaggers of content. But the question is, well, would they be imposed to platforms, and by whom? And because that could have consequences in some countries, again, where the rule of law may be weakened. So perhaps there needs to be clarification as to who these official flaggers are, and really avoid the risk of bias and abuse. And those entities should be definitely independent. When it comes to the transparency of algorithms, there are obligations and measures for service providers for fighting disinformation, for tracking businesses on online marketplaces, and And so the transparency of ads and algorithms, that can be beneficial as long as indeed there's the protection of, the business secrets of companies that they should be taken into account. I think that's probably a worry of industry that will be intensely discussed. And finally, there are platforms of all sizes, and not every platform has the resources or capabilities to develop filters that are, high quality and efficient. You can already see how, even the big ones are struggling to take everything that's toxic down. So I think if you force, and I don't think that's the intention of the DSA, but if you make it some sort of a part of a required criteria to moderate content with using the technology, that can be tricky, and especially. I know not everyone will agree with it, but the technology is not perfect yet to the point that you can't just rely on it entirely for content moderation. That's not tenable.
Okay, thank you, Giga.
Yeah, in my view, the algorithmic transparency is impossible, unwanted, and unneeded. It's impossible because you cannot really inspect the code properly. It's unwanted because that code contains trade secrets of these companies, and it is unneeded because you can kind of supervise them in another way. And this other way is, on one end, as I said, there should be limits to how they limit. There should be limits to what kind of limitations they can put on the users. So it means you could inspect their terms of service, which is text. And you can say, well, yes, this respects human rights, this does not respect human rights. And of course, you can inspect the outputs through scientific work that results in charts that I showed in the very beginning. And as far as trusted flaggers are concerned, of course, the key element is, can they be trusted? Imagine, in this group, imagine that Viktor Orban appoints a trusted flagger for Hungary. How would that look? Probably they would be flagging something quite different than the trusted flagger that is a trusted flagger in Slovenia, which happens to be kind of also very politically biased institution, but on the other side. So it is near impossible, to do it in a way in which there would be no complaints. When you start shaping or prohibiting things on the public square which are legal, but bad taste, bad manners, and so on and so forth. And that's why let's use other measures to improve the quality of the public debate. But let's keep public debate open to everything. Let's see what the stupid and the crazy ones have to say, because this discredits them better than if you silence them and then everybody goes looking for that there must be something true because they have been silenced, and people flock to Gab and all these other sites.
Indeed. Yeah, of course. That's a very important aspect that, in fact, banning the intention to ban doesn't mean that people are actually banned, but that they may get more interesting for some other people. Anyway, Elena, you wanted to have a brief question to the other panelists. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm not sure you'll have a view on this, but I'm grappling with that question around the limitations on advertisement. Because one perspective is to say we should ban political advertisement or even advertisement entirely. But one thing I had in mind was that may not be the answer, because again, not all platforms use that business model like Gab and Parler, or barely. And again, there are different content policy regimes depending on each country. So I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts on that part of the discussion.
Felix?
Banning political advertisement online, I think, is I wouldn't say necessarily dangerous idea, but it's something that should be thought about very, very carefully. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea. If we look at places like Hungary, where the media space is highly controlled by the government, or in many other countries as well, ads and online communications are the only way, for instance, for oppositional groups or NGOs to reach anyone at all and to make their voice heard. So I think that's a very difficult idea. I think that instead we should really push for, as one group from Poland, Panoptykon, I think they're called, said it, for radical transparency. So basically, I should be able to understand why exactly I was targeted, by whom, and on what step of the way, what kind of data was used to identify and profile me. And I should have the right also to take action against that if I think it infringes on my privacy rights, for instance.
Okay, thank you. Let's get back to the questions because we only have 10 minutes left. Karina Stan asks, are these measures leading to the end of the anonymity of the internet? And I think this was a response to what Giga Turk mentioned before. Can you just bring up this whole question about anonymity and identity on the internet? I think Elina was also speaking about this. So maybe either one of you. No? Okay, Elina? You talked about... Yeah, go ahead.
You know, anonymity is important in certain contexts. You definitely remember, the Arab Springs and the color revolutions, etc. And in those romantic times, we thought, oh, the internet is the force of good. It can bring democracy. And it was... Of course, if these people would be, or many of these people would be operating under their real names, they would be simply grabbed by the regime or by the government. And what we came up to is that nowadays many of the conservative commentators, or just usual persons in the West, are very careful in what they say under real name because they could run into problems, into trouble. In their offices because of this hysterical cancel culture and this hysteria against, anything that is outside of this, you would call it liberal democratic consensus. And that is not a sign of a healthy democracy. If people are afraid to say what they think, and if it's polite, let me be clear about that. If they are afraid for their career to express their ideological opinions.
Well, we have a couple of cases in countries like Hungary right now where people are facing hate campaigns by the government because of completely normal things that they said. Now, okay, that sounds like whataboutism, but it's part of the reality.
It's not limited, it's not limited to the liberal, so-called, to the liberal countries. It happens all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's not good. I think we agree that it's the wrong way to go.
Thank you. Elina.
Yeah, thank you. To respond to Karina's question, I do know that there is support, to the right to be anonymous on the internet, as it's in the GDPR. At the same time, some reject, the idea of being unidentifiable online. So, to make sure that while you protect anonymity, everyone is, can be identified digitally where it is necessary. You could have a protected European digital identity. I know that the EPP group, so I'm with the party, the group mentioned using the blockchain technology for that in their position paper. But in any case, there's a level of responsibility of platforms that should be matched or tailored to the identifiability of users. So I hope that answers partially the question. That's my 2 cents on this.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to one last question. about a completely, well, not completely, but an issue that we haven't dealt with at all so far. And this is by Martti Heikkilä, who is from the member of the Academic Council of the Martens Centre. Instead of regulation, Europe must encourage its own tech companies to grow. Why should only American and Chinese companies dominate here? So we're talking about how can Europe somehow catch up in the technological and in the corporate sphere in terms of the digital domain. Who would like to tackle that question?
I can.
All three. Okay. Well, each one gets 2 sentences. Eileen, we start with you.
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward because we hear that very often. I think the issue that the EU hasn't been able to have platforms that scale, it's because we have a digital single market that is still, in many respects, could be still seen as like something that's too theoretical and not enough enforced. You have diverging IP rules, licensing agreements, even for goods, cross-border selling of goods, it's still not that easy. And of course, we're very proud of our regulatory frameworks and that we've set some rules that other countries have been, using as inspiration. Nevertheless, there is complexity in all this, and complexity and uncertainty because of the, again, fragmentation of perhaps in terms of the interpretation by courts of the laws across member states. So I think these are some of the hurdles that will have to be tackled. I know the Commission is looking at this, of course.
Giga.
Oh, that's a question for a couple of trillions of euros. And since I have been involved in Brussels policy making, this always pops up. And I talk a lot about this, and I usually conclude with a quote from Martin Bangemann, who was a commissioner, I think, in the 1990s. And basically, he said it all. He said the problem is that somehow we do not have the innovation and business ecosystem that would be fast and responsive enough for all these new stuff. Our system is good enough for coal and steel, to exaggerate a little bit, and butter. But in digital, somehow the system as such is running smoothly enough. And the solution is not in the digital, the solution is in the overall structure of our business ecosystem.
Felix.
Here I go. Not too much to add. I agree with both. I just would think it slightly unfair to say that the DSA doesn't do anything to address this, because in fact the DSA is intended to harmonize, as both speakers have said before, harmonize rules and clarify the legal framework for companies across the EU. So actually it could end up in producing or creating a more growth and innovation inducive environment for small businesses as well.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, that touches upon the economic constitutionality of the European Union, and that is indeed a very, very broad field. But we can all agree that we have catching up to do. So let me wrap up at this point and maybe present the very subjectively selected takeaways here. Whatever solution the European Union will come up with, it will be a mixture of oversight of the platforms and of regulations by governments or by supranational bodies. In this case, of course, the European Union. And I think there's one important aspect that also came out during this debate. Whatever the platforms limit themselves, there will be limits to what the platforms can limit. So in other words, that is part of the regulatory approach. Is, like if the platforms have oversight, then the governments have oversight over that kind of regulatory power of the platforms themselves. Transparency is another big buzzword here. Laying open the policies that are the basis of the algorithms, which then decide which content the participant or consumer is seeing and is communicated to him. The third very, very important aspect here is building societal resilience. Resilience through education, through civil society, and resilience both in the sense of increasing the quality of the debate, of online discussions and debates, but also resilience in the sense of, well, to put it very, very simply, my grandmother always told me, don't believe every word that you read in the newspaper. And, you know, this is, I think, if this approach could somehow be a more central part of our education systems again, and be applied to social media, then I think we would be probably one step further. And fourth point, maybe last, there is a transatlantic angle in this, that we have an interest, and I think we have a lot to profit from a best practice approach between the US and the European Union. And well, with this, I would like to leave it here. Thank you for giving your kickoff and sharing your insights, Eileen, Giga, and Felix. And thanks to the public here, which so actively participated in the debate with their questions. And I made just one last announcement. The Martens Centre has a weekly, super short interview format, the Week in 7 Questions, and it is with our digital wizard in the Martens Centre, Dimitar Lilkov, this week, about precisely these questions that we've just been discussing. So tune in, it's going to be online this afternoon, and stay safe, stay informed. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.